Midnight sun bled along the line of the ice, turning each floe the color of a cooling blade. On the bridge of a Liberty ship riding low with tanks and trucks, a helmsman kept his hands tight on the wheel while the leadsman watched for brash ice in the lane ahead. The convoy lay spread across the Arctic like a slow city, columns of merchantmen in step, smoke flattened by cold air, Royal Navy and U.S. Navy escorts pacing the flanks with bows that knocked the floes aside. Men huddled in duffel coats and oilskins and blew on their fingers. They kept their eyes on the sky because the sky was the first place trouble showed. The light never died out here in early July. It only dimmed, and that meant bombers could find them at any hour. They called this run PQ-17, bound from Iceland to the Soviet North with the weight of a promise in its holds. Lend-Lease had teeth and wheels and aviation fuel, and all of it had to cross water the enemy owned by habit and range. The escorts knew what the Luftwaffe's Ju-88s and He-111s could do when the air was clear and the sea lanes were tight. The U-boats knew how to wait where lanes narrowed. Farther off, in Norwegian fjords, something heavier lurked. German capital ships, with crews who had trained for the one chance to smash a convoy and still make it home before British battleships could catch them. The first attacks came as practice jabs. Level bombers walked strings across the columns and threw water high over the freighters. A destroyer ahead fired star shells in daylight just to mark a bearing, and its captain called for tighter station keeping. The merchant skippers watched their escorts with the trust of men who know they cannot fight airplanes with deck winches and paint. A boatswain's mate swore softly when a near miss hammered the hull and set the plates singing. Men in gun tubs gripped 20mm triggers and tracked silhouettes that vanished into glare. Signals moved in from the west every few hours, some meant to steady nerves, others to fill gaps. Submarines sighted here, recon aircraft turning back there, distant cover of heavy ships holding station, watching the Norwegian coast. Then, on July 4th, with the sea as flat as it ever got, and the ice pans groaning under their own weight, a new signal crackled over the set and went along the convoy column to column. The words were plain: immediate withdrawal of the cruiser covering force. Another followed, more abrupt, more dangerous. Convoy is to scatter. Bridge crews read it twice because it sounded like a mistake. Out here, survival lived in tight formations and the iron umbrella of cruisers and destroyers. Orders were orders. The cruisers turned away to the west on the strength of intelligence that the German battleship Tirpitz and her consorts had sortied. The convoy commanders broke up the city at sea. Ships that had been numbers in tidy columns lifted signal flags, changed course, poured on steam, and became lonely targets moving alone through a daylight that would not end. Panic was not the word the officers used, though a panic's logic walked through what followed. A freighter angling north for the ice edge ran to cold cover, hoping a flow field would hide its track. Another chose the south and the open water where speed might outpace a bearing. Escorts stayed with a few scatterlings as long as their orders and fuel allowed, then peeled away toward the west to form a screen for the heavy ships. The Atlantic had taught the trade of sailing dark and listening for screws. The Arctic taught something harsher. There is no dark. The water will kill you in minutes, and the aircraft have all the time in the world. The hunters came hard once the shape of the convoy disappeared. Torpedo bombers slipped in low along the glitter of slack water between floes. Bombs walked in from 12 o'clock and from 2. U-boats called bearings on ships they would never have been allowed to touch under a shield of cruisers. A mate on a Liberty ship watched a torpedo wake, break the surface like a white pencil drawing across the lane, and shouted a warning that came too late. The ship ahead lifted in the middle and folded so cleanly that the stern gun kept firing for a minute with no one left to tend it. The men who got boats in the water watched their ship go under flat and fast, cargo still chained below decks. The cold took breath and then speech. Sailors hauled at oars because movement meant heat, and heat meant another minute. Another ship blew its whistle in 3 long cries and settled stern first until the propeller thumped the surface like a warning bell. A tanker burned in silence, flame flattened by the wind, smoke climbing into a sun that refused to move. A Norwegian gunner with a burned cheek asked for a cigarette in a voice that sounded like gravel and tried to light it with 2 shaking hands until a signalman leaned over and cupped the match. A U.S. destroyer found one of the lifeboats and shouldered into the ice to make a lee. The survivors climbed the nets with hands that did not feel the rope. The deck reeked of fuel oil and damp wool, and a hot lunch the cook would leave out until the last of the men were counted. Far back to the west, the heavy ships that might have faced Tirpitz turned for home without firing a shot. The German sortie that had spooked the orders faltered against rocks and indecision and never reached striking distance. None of that helped the singles spread across hundreds of miles. A trawler rigged as an escort took aboard 30 men from one wreck, then stood by another merchantman until the crew refused to abandon, gambling that the ice ahead would hide them if they kept moving. They reached a lead and threaded it, while aircraft searched the open water they had just left behind. The radio traffic turned into a long list of positions and endings. Torpedoed, position given, abandoning ship. Under bombs, steering failing, fires amidships. No air cover, no dark to hide in. Somewhere ashore, in a London room with maps and pins, officers wrote each loss down. At sea, a boatswain looked at a compass card that would not settle because the Arctic could not be bothered with south when every direction led to cold. A young ordinary seaman recited the steps of tying a bowline because it kept his mind from counting the friends he had watched step off a deck into a black slick of fuel. Some ships made it. They stayed near the floe edge and used mist like a curtain, sliding east as if stealing past a doorman. A tug brought one damaged freighter under its arm and hauled it stubbornly toward the White Sea until both crews slept standing up. Soviet pilots met a few of the stragglers and guided them toward rivers whose banks were crowded with men ready to unload what war could not do without. When the counting finished, only a handful of merchantmen from the original formation reached port. Most of the rest lay along a track of water that glittered like any other patch of Arctic sea and held its dead without remark. Afterward, the official words were careful. Intelligence had reported the risk of a surface sortie. Prudence demanded that the cruisers not be thrown away. The order to scatter had been made in the dark of uncertainty. The men who had stood on those bridges took the meaning into their own bones. Once the shield lifted and the line broke, the enemy did not need brilliance to win. He needed daylight and fuel and time. The Arctic gave him all 3. In mess halls and galleys, in barber shops and on cold quays, the sailors told the story the way sailors do, starting with weather and ending with names. They said the sea was flat as a table when the word came to run. They said the bombers were specks that grew and drew lines of water like handwriting no one could misread. They said a ship with a deckload of tanks went down so quickly that the tanks broke free and drifted for miles, steel beasts that looked for a minute like a rescue that would never come. They said a destroyer captain cried when he had to turn away on orders and leave a freighter that had signaled him 3 times by name. Years later, the route would be taken again under different rules, with heavier air cover and discipline in the face of rumors. But the men who ran PQ-17 held the memory like frostbite, long-healed but tender to the touch. They knew the feeling of a deck humming under the weight of a full cargo bound for a front that could not hold without it. They knew the sound of a signalman reading out a message that turned a city into a scatter of single lives. They knew, because they had lived it, how a convoy dies, not in one blow, but ship by ship, in daylight that refuses to end. The Arctic never tells you why it spares this ship and not that one. It only gives you the facts you can write down and the rest you carry quiet. On those long days in July, the men of PQ-17 learned what it costs when fear outruns the enemy. The sea kept most of the receipts. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.